7 wives, 7 graves, and every soul in Bitter Hollow swore the 8th woman who stood beside Rowan Vance would be buried before the first frost. They called him cursed. They called him a killer wearing a man's skin. But Mara Quinn looked at the whispers, looked at the dirt, looked at the shadow stretching long behind that broken mountain man, and she did something nobody in the Wyoming Territory had the spine to do. She refused to look away. Stay with me until the end of this story, hit that like button, and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The wind came down off the Bighorns the way wind always came down off the Bighorns in late October, mean and dry, smelling of pine sap and old snow that hadn't fallen yet. It rattled the loose tin on the roof of Dr. Eldon Crane's surgery and made the lantern flame shiver inside its glass. And Mara Quinn, who had been stitching a gash in a teamster's forearm for the better part of 20 minutes, did not look up. "Hold still, Mr. Pike." "I am holding still." "You're not. You're flinching every time the needle goes in, and that's why this is taking so long." Cal Pike was a man with a face like a sun-dried apple and a grudge against most things that walked upright, and he had been complaining for 19 of those 20 minutes. He shifted his bulk on the stool, sweat darkening the collar of his union suit, and squinted at the woman bent over his arm. "You stitch like a man," he said. "I stitch like someone who's done it 300 times, Mara said. "Hold still." "You're built like a man, too." "No offense." She tied off the thread and snipped it with a pair of small scissors. The cut was clean now, 8 neat stitches running down the meat of his forearm like a railroad track. She did not look at his face when she answered him. "None taken, Mr. Pike. I find men generally have hands that work and backs that bend, and I've got both, so it suits me fine." She wrapped the arm in clean linen and pinned it. Pike watched her from under his eyebrows. She was tall, a hand taller than most men in Bitter Hollow, with shoulders that filled the doorway of the surgery when she stood square in it, and hands that could palm a horseshoe. Her hair was the color of wet straw, pulled back so hard it gave her a permanent look of mild irritation, and her eyes were a flat, considering gray. People in town had called her many things. Big Mara, the doctor's mule, the spinster of the surgery. She had stopped hearing most of it by the time she was 20, and she was 26 now. "Doc Crane out again?" Pike said. "At the Mortensen place, the boy's lung fever." "That's a hard ride." "It is." "We're going to make it?" "I don't know, Mr. Pike. I'm not at the Mortensen place. I'm here, with you." Pike grunted. He fished in his pocket with his good hand and laid $2 silver on the surgery table and stood up slowly, the way a man stands up when he has been drinking the night before and pretending he hadn't been. He looked at the coins and then at her. "You hear about Vance?" The needle, which Mara had been cleaning with carbolic, paused for half a second in her hand. Then it moved again. "I've heard a great deal about Mr. Vance over the years, Mr. Pike. None of it from anyone who knows him." "He's back." She did not answer. "Come down out of the high country 2 days ago. Bought salt and coffee and powder at Hennessy's store and didn't say 3 words. Hennessy said his eyes looked dead. Hennessy says everyone's eyes look dead. Hennessy's eyes look dead. This is different." Pike lowered his voice, the way men do when they want to suggest weight without doing the work of providing it. 7, now. He's up to 7. 7 what? Don't be cute, you know what? Mara set the needle down in its tray. She turned and faced him, and Cal Pike, who was a big man, took a small involuntary step back, which was a thing he would later deny. "I know what people say," she said. "I know that a man's wife died of childbed fever in 78, and people say he killed her. I know his second wife drowned crossing the Powder River in spring flood, and people say he held her under. I know his third was struck by lightning in an open field, and people say he called it down. I know what people say, Mr. Pike. Saying it loud enough and often enough doesn't make it true. 7 women, Miss Quinn. 7 tragedies. Death follows that man. Death follows everybody. It's just that Mr. Vance has had the bad fortune of it following him in front of an audience." Pike picked up his coat with his good hand and worked it over the bandaged arm with a small grunt of pain. At the door, he paused and looked back at her, and there was something in his face that was not quite contempt and not quite pity, but something neighborly to both. "You're a smart woman, Miss Quinn. Too smart for your own good, maybe. But you stay away from him, hear me? You stay clear. Whatever it is on him, I don't care if you believe in it or not." The door closed behind him and the bell above it rang once, and Mara Quinn stood alone in the surgery with the smell of carbolic and blood and lantern oil. And she said to nobody, "It doesn't care if I believe in it because it doesn't exist." But her hands were not quite steady when she put the needle back in its case. She walked home in the blue hour. Bitter Hollow was not much of a town. A main street of stamped dirt with plank sidewalks on either side, 4 saloons and 1 church, a livery, a Wells Fargo office, Hennessy's general store with its painted sign peeling in the dry wind, and the railhead 2 miles east where the cattle came down out of the high country in the fall and went east on the cars. 140 souls, give or take, depending on who was passing through and who had recently shot whom. The mountains stood up to the west like a wall the world had built to keep the sky in place. She lived in 2 rooms behind the surgery. Her father had been a doctor in St. Joseph before the war and had taught her to read at 4 and to set a bone at 12. And when he died of a stroke the spring she turned 18, he had left her a medical bag, a leather-bound copy of Gray's Anatomy, and the address of an old colleague named Eldon Crane in the Wyoming Territory, who needed an assistant and didn't care that the assistant was a woman because the assistant was free. She had been here 8 years. There was a stove in her front room, and she lit it now and put water on for tea and sat in the one good chair and looked at the lamp and thought about Rowan Vance. She had seen him exactly twice in 8 years. The first time had been her second week in town. She had been 17 and afraid of everything, and she had been crossing the street with an armful of laundry, and a man had been coming up the street the other way, leading a black horse, and she had stopped because the horse was so beautiful. The man had been tall and lean and bearded, and his eyes, when he looked at her, had been the color of river ice in March. He had touched the brim of his hat to her, the way a man does to a stranger he means no trouble, and he had walked on, and she had stood in the middle of the street with her laundry and watched him go. And a woman behind her on the boardwalk had said in a low, ugly voice, "That's him." The second time had been 4 years later. She had been called out with Doc Crane to a burned-out homestead on the South Fork of the Powder, where a chimney fire had taken the cabin and a woman and a child inside it. They had ridden up at dawn, and there had been a man sitting on a charred log in the smoke with his face in his hands. And that man had been Rowan Vance, and the woman had been his 5th wife, and the child had been hers from a previous marriage. He had not spoken to them. He had not looked up. Doc Crane had said, "Rowan, son, is there anything?" And Vance had shaken his head once, slow, without lifting it, and they had ridden away. Mara had looked back from the rise. He was still sitting there. The smoke was going straight up in the still, cold air. She had thought about him on and off for years. Not the way a girl thinks about a man. She had never been the kind of woman a man courted, and she had stopped expecting it before she was old enough to vote, which was a thing she could not do anyway. She thought about him the way a doctor's daughter thinks about a case. 7 wives. 8, counting the first, who had died before he ever came to the territory. The one nobody ever counted because she had died of the cholera in Missouri in 74, and there had been no curse to her, only a bad summer in a bad town. Then 6 more after he came west. Each one a story. Each story stranger than the last. And the town, which had been waiting for someone to be the devil since before there had been a town, had given him the job. She sipped her tea. The wind came down the chimney and made the stove door rattle. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote yipped and was answered. She thought, "He came down for salt and coffee and powder. He's going back up. He'll be on the trail at first light." She thought, "None of my business." She thought, "None of my business at all." Then she put the cup down and went to bed. She was woken at 4:45 by Tom Bidwell pounding on her door. Tom Bidwell was 16 years old and worked the night shift at the livery, and he was the kind of boy who ran everywhere because he had been told once that he was slow and had never quite gotten over it. He was out of breath when she opened the door, and the lantern in his hand was shaking, and his face under his cap was the color of skim milk. Miss Quinn, there's been down at the river. The crossing below the bend. There's a horse in the water and a man under the horse, and the ice broke under him. And Jed Marsh come up to tell me, and he won't go down there because it's..." "Slow down. It's Vance, Miss Quinn. It's Rowan Vance." She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Get my bag, the black one on the second shelf, and bring rope. All the rope you can find." "Doc Crane ain't back." "I know." "You can't..." "Tom, get the bag." He got the bag. The bend of the Powder River below Bitter Hollow ran shallow in summer and froze hard by Christmas, but in the last week of October it was the worst kind of water, half-skinned with brittle gray ice over a cold green current, still pulling strong from the snowmelt in the high country. The trail down from town came out of a stand of cottonwoods on a low cut bank, and you could see the crossing from a quarter-mile up. And what Mara saw when she came around the last bend on the borrowed horse was a black gelding standing chest-deep in the river with its head thrown back and its eyes rolling white, and a man in the water beside it with one arm hooked through the saddle and the other arm not visible at all. The ice had given way in a long jagged crescent. Pieces of it the size of cabin doors were tilted up around the horse like teeth. Mara was off her horse before it stopped moving. She thrust the reins at Tom. Tie him to that cottonwood and bring me the rope." "Miss Quinn." "Now, Tom." She went down the cut bank in 3 long strides and stopped at the edge of the ice. The water was perhaps 15 feet from where she stood to where the horse was. The horse saw her coming and tried to lunge toward her, and the ice cracked again under its forelegs, and it screamed the way horses scream, which is a sound that does not leave a person who has heard it. "Easy, easy, you damned fool, easy." The man in the water lifted his head. His face was white. His beard was full of frost. His lips were the color of slate. He looked at her, and for a long second he did not seem to understand what he was looking at. And then he did. And he said, in a voice that came out of his chest like a board being snapped in half, "Go back. Be quiet. Lady, go back. The ice." "I said be quiet. Tom, the rope." Tom came skidding down the bank with a coil of half-inch hemp rope over his shoulder, and Mara took one end of it and looped it under her arms and tied a bowline at her sternum with her eyes still on the man in the water, and she handed the other end to Tom and said, "Take it around the cottonwood twice." "Twice, Tom. Then brace. If I go under, you pull. You don't think, you pull." "Yes, ma'am." "Vance." The man in the water did not answer. His eyes had drifted shut. "Rowan Vance. Look at me." His eyes opened. "I am coming out there. You are going to put your free arm around my shoulders. We are going to get the horse first. Do you understand me?" "Get the horse first," he repeated, like a man repeating a word in a foreign language. "Yes. You're not real." "I am perfectly real, Mr. Vance. Stay awake." She went out on the ice on her belly. She had done this twice before in her life, once for a boy who had fallen through chasing a duck, and once for a calf. And she knew the trick of it, which was to spread her weight and move slowly and let the ice tell her when it was lying. She was a heavy woman, and she did not pretend otherwise, and her weight was a problem here. But her weight was also the reason she could break the ice ahead of her with her elbows, where she needed to break it and drive the broken pieces under with her forearms. And that was what she did, foot by foot, until she was within arm's reach of the black gelding and could see the man's other arm now, the one that had not been visible from the bank, and saw why it had not been visible. It was caught. The reins had wrapped twice around his wrist and once around the saddle horn, and the horse in its panic had twisted the leather into a knot that no living hand was going to untie with fingers that had been in that water for what had to be 20 minutes by now. She drew the knife from her belt. "Mr. Vance?" "I am going to cut you loose from your horse. Do you understand?" Don't cut him loose. He'll drown." "He won't drown. I'm cutting you loose from him." "Oh." A small, terrible smile twitched at the corner of his mouth. "All right." She got the knife in under the reins and sawed. The leather was stiff with cold and slick with water, and it took longer than it should have, and twice the gelding lunged and nearly took her under, and once a piece of ice the size of her hand sheared off the edge she was lying on and went black under the current, but the leather parted, and the man's arm came free, and she got her arm under his shoulders and pulled him against her chest and shouted, "Tom, pull! Pull now!" The rope went tight. She felt it bite into her ribs. She kicked back from the horse, and the horse, freed of the man's weight on the reins, found purchase suddenly with one hind hoof, and surged, and the ice broke open further, and there was a long bad moment when Mara thought the horse was going to come down on top of them both, but it didn't. It lunged again, and on the fourth lunge it heaved itself up onto a solid shelf and stood there shaking, head down, blowing great gouts of steam into the dawn. Tom pulled. Mara kicked. The man in her arms did not move, and she could not feel him breathing, and she could not tell if her own breathing had stopped because she was so cold she could not feel her chest at all. They came up onto the bank on their backs, scraping over rocks and roots. Tom was crying. She could hear him crying, and he was a good boy, and she would tell him so later. But right now she rolled the man onto his side and put 2 fingers under his jaw and waited. There was a pulse, slow as a beat in a frozen drum. But there. He's alive. Miss Quinn, your hands... My hands are fine, Tom. Get a fire going, right there, against the bank. Use the deadfall under the cottonwood. Hurry, boy. Miss, hurry. She stripped the man's coat off, which was a saturated dead weight, and his shirt under it, and rolled him in her own wool cloak, which had stayed mostly dry on the ride out. And she put her ear to his chest, and she heard his heart, slow and stubborn. And she put her forehead briefly against his sternum the way a person sometimes does without meaning to, and then she sat back and got to work on saving his life. The fire took a long time to build because the wood was wet and Tom's hands were shaking, but it took. Mara worked over the man on the bank in the gray dawn light. She cut his wet trousers off him with the knife. She did not look at his face while she did it because she had been a doctor's assistant for 14 years, and a body was a body. And she had not done much of this work on a man not under a sheet in a surgery, but the principle was the same. Get the wet off. Get the warm on. Watch the breathing. Watch the pulse. Talk, even if he could not hear, because sometimes they could. Mr. Vance, your horse is alive. Your horse is on the bank, and your horse is alive and shaking and angry, and he hates you a little, but he's alive. You hear me? You came out of that river. Most men don't. You did. So you're going to keep coming out of it. You're going to keep your end up. His eyes opened once, just slits, and looked at her without focus. Said, go back, he whispered. I heard you. Why'd you not go back? Because I'm an idiot, Mr. Vance. Close your eyes. He closed them. By the time the sun was full up over the rim of the bluffs, his color was coming back into his lips. By full morning, he was conscious enough to drink the broth Tom had run back to town for, although he could not hold the cup himself. By noon, Mara had him on the back of Tom's mule, lashed there with rope so he would not slide, and the black gelding tied behind, and they were moving up the trail toward Bitter Hollow, with Tom leading and Mara walking alongside the mule with one hand on the man's leg to make sure he was still on it. He spoke once on the ride. You shouldn't have come for me, miss. Quinn? Mara Quinn. Miss Quinn, you shouldn't have. I work for the doctor. The doctor comes for people. I came for you. They'll talk. They've been talking for years, Mr. Vance, about you, about me. I don't know that there's anything left for them to say. His head had fallen forward against the mule's neck. His eyes were closed, but his mouth made a shape she did not recognize at first, and then realized was a smile, very faint, very tired. Oh, he said, there's always more, Miss Quinn. Masik. The trouble started at the edge of town. She had been hoping to come in by the back trail behind the smithy and get him to the surgery without ceremony, but they had been seen on the rise an hour out, and by the time they crested the last hill above Bitter Hollow, there was a knot of men standing in the road, and she counted, before she meant to count, 11 of them. Hennessy was at the front. Hennessy was a small man with a wide red face and the particular kind of self-importance that comes from being the only person in town who can extend credit. Beside him was Pastor Dawes, who had come west from Pennsylvania a decade before to save souls and had instead spent 10 years discovering how very many ways there were to drink. And behind them, in a loose half-moon that suggested they had been told to stand there but were not sure what to do with their hands, the rest. Pike with his bandaged arm, old Mort Casey from the livery, the Bidwell brothers, Tom's older cousins, a couple of cowhands she didn't know. Mara stopped the mule. Mr. Hennessy. Miss Quinn. Hennessy's eyes went past her to the man slumped on the mule. His mouth tightened. What have you got there? I have got a half-drowned man on a mule, Mr. Hennessy, and I'm taking him to the surgery. That's Vance. I know who it is. You can't bring him in. I beg your pardon? A small sound went through the men behind Hennessy. Not a word, the kind of sound a crowd makes when it has been told what to feel and is rehearsing the feeling. You can't bring him in, Miss Quinn. The town's had enough. He goes back where he came from. He'll die before nightfall if he goes back where he came from. He's hypothermic, Mr. Hennessy. He's got the beginnings of frostbite in 2 fingers. He took in river water. He needs a fire and a bed and someone watching his breathing for the next 12 hours. And if any of you can tell me how he gets that on the back of a horse alone in the mountains, I would like to hear it." Pastor Dawes stepped up next to Hennessy. His eyes were watery. His coat smelled of last night's whiskey from where Mara was standing, and she was standing 6 feet away. "Daughter," he said, "I am not your daughter." "Daughter, you do not know what you do." "I know exactly what I'm doing, Pastor. I'm bringing a patient to a surgery." "That man is a man. He is a man, Pastor. He's not a demon, and he's not a curse, and he's not a sign, and he's not a warning. He is a man who took a horse across a river, and the ice broke under him and he nearly died, and I am sorry that does not fit the story you've been telling about him for 7 years, but it is the truth, and I am bringing him in. And any one of you who wants to stop me can step into this road, and we'll see what God thinks about that." She had not meant to say the last bit. It had come out anyway. Pastor Dawes blinked. Hennessy did not move. But none of the men behind him moved either, and that was the thing she had been counting on, the thing she had bet the man's life on, which was that none of them, not Hennessy, and not Dawes, and not the Bidwells, and not Pike, with his stitches she had put in last night, none of them wanted to be the one to lay hands on Mara Quinn in the middle of the main road in front of God and everybody. "Miss Quinn," Hennessy said finally. His voice was very low. "If something happens, if anyone in this town dies in the next month, we will know whose door to come to." "You always know whose door to come to, Mr. Hennessy. It's how a town works." She clucked to the mule, and the mule walked forward, and the men in the road parted, slow, the way a curtain parts when somebody pulls it sideways with their hand. And she walked her mule and her boy and her dying man and her stolen horse through the middle of Bitter Hollow at the noon hour with every window on Main Street holding a face, and she did not look at any of them, and she did not stop until she was at her own door. What? He did not wake until full dark. She had him in the spare cot in the back room of the surgery in 3 blankets, with a hot water bottle at his feet and another at his side. And she had been changing the water in the bottles every half hour since they had come in. Doc Crane had still not returned from the Mortensen place. Tom Bidwell had been sent home to his mother with strict instructions not to talk to anybody, which she knew he would ignore, but there was nothing for it. She was sitting in the chair by the cot reading by lamplight when she heard his breathing change. She looked up. His eyes were open. They were focused now. They were the color she remembered from 8 years ago, river ice gray, but not dead, not the dead eyes Hennessy had described. Tired eyes. Eyes that had been awake for a long time and had seen too many things and were now looking at a ceiling they did not recognize. "Mr. Vance." "I'm in a house." "You're in the surgery." "Behind the doctor's office. In Bitter Hollow." "How long?" "You've been here about 10 hours. He closed his eyes again. He did not open them when he spoke. "You shouldn't have brought me here. You've said, 'They'll come.' They came. They went." His eyes opened. "They came?" "To the edge of town. They stood in the road. They wanted me to take you back into the hills. And I didn't." He looked at her then, properly, for what was probably the first time. The lamp was low and warm, and it pulled the long bones of his face out of the shadow and showed her for a second a younger man than the one she had heard about for 8 years. A man who had been handsome once before he had been hammered into a different shape. "Why?" he said. "Because you needed a surgery and I had one." "That's not why." "It is, actually." "No, ma'am, it isn't." She did not answer that. She got up and went to the stove and poured him a cup of broth from the pot and brought it back and held it for him, and he drank it slow, with his hands wrapped around hers around the cup because his fingers were still not working right. And when he had drunk half of it, he let his head go back against the pillow and looked at the lamp. "You should send me out of here at first light," he said, "before they come back. They will come back." "Mr. Vance?" "Rowan." "Mr. Vance, I'm not going to send you anywhere at first light. You have frostbite in 2 fingers on your left hand and the beginnings of pneumonia in your right lung, and you are not going to die in the mountains because a banker and a drunk preacher told a woman in a road that you should. Now drink the rest of this." He drank the rest of it. When she took the cup away, his hand caught hers, very weak, around the wrist. His skin was hot now where it had been cold this morning, and that was a thing she would have to watch through the night, but his grip was real. 8, he said. I'm sorry? My first wife. In Missouri, cholera. Nobody counts her. They count 7. I know about Missouri, Mr. Vance. You know about Missouri. My father was a doctor in St. Joseph. He treated cholera in the summer of '74. There was a great deal of it. He looked at her for a long time. His eyes were wet, but she did not think it was from feeling, exactly. She thought it was that he was very tired and very warm for the first time in a long time, and his body was doing what bodies do when they have been held too tight for too long. You're not afraid of me, he said. No. Why? Because I don't believe in curses, Mr. Vance. I believe in cholera, and river ice, and lightning, and childbed fever, and chimney fires. I believe in things that kill people, and I believe people who are unlucky get killed more often than people who are lucky. And I believe you are an unlucky man. I'm sorry for it, but sorry is not the same as afraid. His grip on her wrist tightened, then went loose. His eyes closed. Miss Quinn. Mara, they'll burn this building down with us in it if they decide to. They won't decide to tonight. You don't know that. No, I don't. But the doctor will be back tomorrow, and once the doctor is back, they are dealing with the doctor. And the doctor has been in this town 22 years, and they will not burn his surgery. So we have until tomorrow morning. Sleep, Mr. Vance. Rowan. Sleep, Rowan. He slept. She sat in the chair by the cot with the lamp turned low and her father's Gray's Anatomy open on her lap, because she always had it open when she was thinking, even though she had not read a word of it in an hour, and she listened to him breathe. The breathing was rough, but it was steady. The wind came off the mountains and rattled the tin on the roof. Out on Main Street somewhere a dog was barking and stopped and started again. She thought about the 7 graves. She thought about how a story gets told. She thought, he's a case. He's a case like any other. There is a reason for each of them, and the reasons are not connected, and I will find them if I look. It's only arithmetic in the end. It's only arithmetic and bad weather and bad luck, and a town that needed somebody to put it on. She thought, I will look. She thought, I will look until I find every one of them. And then, because she was a woman of 26 who had not slept in 20 hours, and had pulled a man out of a freezing river that morning and had walked him through a town full of people who wanted him dead, she put her head down on the edge of the cot, next to his sleeping shoulder, and she let herself rest for 1 minute, just one, before she would get up and change the water in the bottles again. She slept 4 hours. When she woke, it was still dark, and his hand was on the back of her head, very light, the way a man rests a hand on a thing he is afraid he might break. And his breathing was deep and even, and somewhere outside in Bitter Hollow, somebody was hammering on a door that was not hers, not yet, and the lamp had almost burned out. She did not move. She lay there with her face against the rough wool of the blanket, and the smell of carbolic and wood smoke, and a man's skin in her nose. And she listened to the hammering get farther away down the street, and she thought, very clearly, all right then. And outside, the wind came down off the bighorns the way the wind always came down off the bighorns in late October, mean and dry, smelling of pine sap and old snow that had not fallen yet, but would. Doc Crane came back from the Mortensen place at 7 in the morning with mud to his thighs and the look of a man who had not slept and had lost the thing he stayed up for. He came through the surgery door without knocking, the way a man enters a room that is his, and stopped when he saw the cot and the figure in it and Mara in the chair beside it, with a medical notebook open on her knee. He stood there for a moment. He was 61 years old, Eldon Crane, with a white beard and the careful, steady hands of a man who had been practicing medicine on the frontier for 30 years and had learned to waste nothing, not motion and not feeling. He looked at the man on the cot. He looked at Mara. He set his bag down on the surgery table. The Mortensen boy died at 4 this morning, he said. I'm sorry. Who is that? Rowan Vance. Crane looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked to the cot and put 2 fingers under the man's jaw and checked the pulse and lifted one eyelid and looked at the pupil and straightened up. What happened? River crossing below the bend. The ice gave way. He and the horse both went in. He was in the water approximately 20 minutes before I reached him. Frostbite, 2nd degree on the 3rd and 4th fingers of the left hand. Fluid in the right lung. I've been running a fever check every 2 hours. He came down 1.3 degrees overnight. Crane was quiet for a moment. He pulled the stool to the cot and sat and began his own examination, his fingers moving over the man's hands with the careful, impersonal attention of someone who has promised to pay attention regardless of what he finds. Hennessy came to the Mortensen place last night, he said. I thought he might. Woke me out of what little sleep I was getting to tell me you'd brought this man into my surgery. Your surgery was available and the man needed it. I know that. He did not look up from the hands. That's not why Hennessy came. I know why Hennessy came. Crane pressed gently along the swollen line of the frostbitten fingers, and the man on the cot made a short, involuntary sound, and his eyes opened. He looked at the ceiling, then he turned his head and looked at Crane. Then he looked past Crane at Mara, and something in his face settled, the way a man's face settles when he wakes up afraid, and then finds the thing that tells him where he is. Doctor, he said. Mr. Vance. Crane kept his hands where they were. You're going to lose the feeling in these two fingers for some weeks. Maybe longer. The frostbite is deep, but I don't think we're looking at amputation if you stay off the trail and keep them warm. Can you do that? I was planning to leave today. You were planning to die today then? Because if you ride into the mountains with that lung and those hands, you'll be dead before the snow finds you. Vance looked at the ceiling again. Mara, he said, not to her but about her, the way a person names a fact. She found you, Crane said. She brought you in. You'd have been under that river without her. I know. Then you know what I'm going to tell her when she asks me what to do with you. Vance turned his head and looked at Mara, and she looked back at him over the notebook. And the look that passed between them was not the look of a doctor and a patient. It was something else, something that had been building since the river, and neither of them had a name for it yet, and neither of them reached for one. She's going to say I should stay, Vance said. I'm going to say you should stay, Mara said. At least a week. The fever has to break completely and the lung has to clear. You know this. He looked at the ceiling. They'll come, he said. Hennessy. Let Hennessy come to me, Crane said. He stood up from the stool, his knees cracking. I've been in this town longer than Hennessy's store has been standing. Let him come. The fever broke on the third day. Mara was there when it happened, as she had been there for most of the previous 72 hours, sleeping in the chair or on the floor with her coat over her, and waking at any change in his breathing. Doc Crane came mornings and evenings. The rest of the time it was Mara and the stove, and the low lamp, and the sound of wind off the mountains. He was not an easy patient. The first morning, fully conscious and warm, and starting to feel his own discomfort, he tried to get out of the cot twice. The first time she stopped him with a hand on his chest, flat, firm, and he looked at her hand and then at her face and lay back down because there was something in her face that he had learned already was not a negotiating position. The second time he got his legs over the side and sat there swaying slightly, white in the lips, before she came and put both arms under his and simply lifted him back, the way a person lifts a heavy thing they have done the math on, and he was too weak to argue with the math. You are not going anywhere, she said. I need to move. You can move tomorrow. Today you're staying flat. You can't make me stay flat. I just put you back in that bed with one arm, Mr. Vance. Would you like to test the other one? He looked at her. Something between outrage and amusement moved across his face, and she thought that was probably the first time that particular expression had lived there in some years. You've got a temper on you, he said. I've got a patient who keeps trying to kill himself. It brings something out in me. He stayed flat, but he talked more those 3 days. In the beginning, it was the flat, compelled honesty of fever, the kind that comes when the body is too tired to keep the usual walls up. He talked in fragments, names she did not know, a river she could not place. His first wife, whose name had been Clara, who had been 20 years old and kind and dead in 3 days from the cholera, and who he had not been able to help no matter what he did. He talked about the way the town in Missouri had looked at him afterward, the first time he had felt it, that particular human hunger that looks for the shape of a monster in a man who has only had bad luck. She wrote some of it down. She had decided to write it down. On the second day, when he was clearer, he saw her doing it. What are you writing? Notes. What kind of notes? The kind a doctor makes. When did this happen? How did it happen? What was the cause? He was quiet for a moment. Outside the surgery window, a pair of starlings fought over something on the boardwalk with a great deal of noise. You're trying to figure it out, he said. Yes. There's nothing to figure out. They died. I was there. That's the whole of it. That is not the whole of it. Cause of death, contributing circumstances, whether any two of them share a common thread that has nothing to do with you. That's the whole of it. He looked at her from the pillow for a long time. Clara, he said. Cholera, summer of 74. I told you. You told me. I have it. She did not look up from the notebook. Tell me about the second one. He was quiet so long she thought he had decided not to. Then he said, her name was Dolores. She came from a family down in Colorado Territory. We married in the spring of 76. He stopped. She was not built for the territory. She tried. She was not built for it. She drowned at the Powder River crossing. Spring flood. The crossing she chose was 2 miles north of the safe ford. I had told her the safe ford. I had drawn it out for her on paper. She was going to her sister's for the week, and she cut across the hills and came out at the wrong place, and she crossed anyway because she was Dolores, and telling Dolores she couldn't do a thing was the same as daring her to do it. He said the last part with something that was not quite a smile and was not quite grief, but lived in the same county as both. Mara wrote it down. She made that choice herself, she said. Yes. It had nothing to do with you. I knew the spring flood. I should have ridden with her. You couldn't have known she'd take the wrong ford. No. His voice was flat now. But they said I sent her into it knowing. They said I knew what the spring flood does to a woman on a green horse. People say a great many things, Rowan. He looked at her when she used his name, and she did not drop her eyes from the notebook. By the third morning, the fever broke in a sweat that soaked the blankets through, and she changed them and changed his undershirt because he could not do it himself yet, with the hands. And she did all of it with the same practical, unsentimental efficiency that she used when she set a bone or lanced an infected cut. And he watched her the way a man watches something he cannot quite make sense of, the way you watch a thing that should be one thing and keeps being another. When she was done, he caught her wrist again, like the first night, but different now, more deliberate. Why are you writing it down? He said. The real reason. She looked at his hand on her wrist. Then she looked at him. Because if I can show what killed each of them, she said, and show that none of it was you, and show that on paper with cause and circumstance and the plain logic of it, then whatever Hennessy and Dawes and the rest of them are carrying around in their heads about you is just a story, and stories can be rewritten. He let go of her wrist. He lay back. He stared at the ceiling. You'd be taking on the whole town, he said. I've been taking on the whole town for 8 years. This is different. Everything is always different until you do it. He was quiet. Then, 2 of them I haven't told anyone. 2 of the 7, not the real story. Then tell me. He turned his head and looked at her. It'll change what you think of me. I very much doubt that, she said, and opened her notebook to a fresh page. He told her. He told her about Ruth, the third wife, the one struck by lightning in an open field in the summer of 78. He had been a quarter-mile away when it happened. He had seen it. She had been standing at the fence line watching the storm come over the ridge, which she always did because she had grown up on the Texas coast where storms came in off the water and were worth watching, and she had not been afraid of them the way a sensible person in an open field ought to be. He told Mara that the way Ruth had stood and watched things other people ran from, and he told it the way a man tells a thing about someone he loved, which was flatly and carefully and like he was handling glass. He told her about the fourth wife, Anna, who had died of childbed fever in February of 81. He told her that the midwife had known something was wrong 3 days before and had not sent for the doctor because it was a hard ride and the weather was bad and women sometimes had fever in labor, and it passed. By the time he had ridden for the doctor himself, the fever had been in Anna for 72 hours. The doctor, who was not Crane but the old one before Crane, had told him there was nothing to be done by then. Nothing to have been done at all. The midwife's name was Agnes Fremont, he said. I know Agnes Fremont. Then you know she told people afterward that she had sent for the doctor immediately, and I had refused. Mara kept writing. Agnes Fremont, she said, has been lying about most things since she came here in 77, and everyone in town knows it, and nobody says it because she is the only midwife within 40 miles. He was quiet for a moment. You knew. I suspected. Now I know. Keep going. He went through the rest of them quietly and with the particular care of a man who has told himself he will not feel these things anymore and finds, when he opens the door, that they are all still there. Each one a name, each name a story. Each story a thing the town had taken and twisted into something that made their fear feel reasonable, their cruelty feel earned. When he was done, Mara sat with the notebook closed in her lap and her hands over it. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals, and the light in the surgery was the thin gray light of mid-morning in late October, flat and cold through the window glass. 6 of them are plain cause and circumstance, she said finally. The 7th. Vera. Tell me about Vera. She left me, he said, last year. She was alive when she left, and she was alive when she got to her sister's house in Cheyenne, and she was alive when the sister wrote to tell me not to try to follow. He paused. She died 6 months later of a cancer they found in the winter. The doctor who told me wrote to say she had likely had it for 2 years, since before I knew her. Mara did not write anything. She looked at him. She left you. Yes. She was alive. Yes. And still they count her. They count her because she died within the year, because the story needed her. His voice had gone very flat. Not angry, just flat. The way a thing goes flat when it has been pressed on too many times. Vera was afraid. By the time she left, she was afraid of me, and afraid of the thing people said followed me. And I couldn't tell her she was wrong, because by then I wasn't sure myself. You're sure now? He looked at her. Are you? He said. Not a question, exactly. Yes, she said. I'm sure. 6 deaths with 6 distinct and separate causes. None of them connected to you beyond the fact of your presence. One woman who left and died of a pre-existing illness 8 months later. That is not a curse, Rowan. That is a man who has had a very hard decade and lived near people who wanted an explanation for hard things. He looked at her face, the way he had been looking at her face these 3 days, like a man checking a compass he is not entirely sure he trusts yet. And she met his eyes and did not look away. From somewhere out on the street came the sound of voices, low and carrying, the kind of voices that are not talking to each other but at a door. Mara stood up and went to the window and looked out. Hennessy. 4 other men she recognized, standing on the boardwalk across the street from the surgery. Not approaching, just standing, making the point of themselves. Hennessy, she said. Vance did not move on the cot. How many? 5. He'll come in today. He won't come into Crane's surgery. He will when Crane isn't here. She looked at the 5 men across the street. She thought about the notebook in her lap with its 6 sets of notes and its 6 clear causes and its 1 dying woman who had left a man who was tired. She thought about what Hennessy would do with a notebook if she handed it to him and asked him to read it. Then I'll make sure Crane is here, she said. She let the curtain fall back across the window and went to put more wood in the stove, and she could feel Rowan Vance's eyes on her back the whole way there, steady, considering, like a man watching something he has not decided yet whether to trust, but is starting to think he might. Crane came back from his noon rounds to find Hennessy sitting in the chair across from his desk. Hennessy had not been invited. He had also, evidently, not waited to be let in, because Mara was standing in the doorway between the front office and the surgery with her arms crossed and the flat look on her face that meant she had told someone to wait outside and they had not. Crane set his bag on the desk and looked at Hennessy and did not sit down. I'll assume this is urgent, Crane said. It is. Hennessy put his hat on his knee. He had the manner of a man conducting a formal negotiation, which meant he had rehearsed this. The town wants Vance gone, Eldon. That's the plain fact of it. He's been here 6 days. Every morning I open my store, there are men on my porch asking me what's being done about it, and I'm running out of things to tell them. You could tell them the man is sick and under a doctor's care. I've told them that. Then keep telling them. It's not enough anymore. Hennessy's voice was still measured, but there was something under it, a heat that the measured quality was there to manage. You've got a woman in there alone with him half the day and all the night. People are talking about that too. People can talk about whatever they like. Eldon, I mean that, Frank. They can talk. Crane sat down now slowly and folded his hands on the desk. I have examined that man. He has frostbite in 2 fingers that hasn't fully resolved, and a lung that is clearing but is not clear. He is not fit to travel. When he is fit to travel, he'll travel. That is the end of my position on this matter. Hennessy looked at Mara in the doorway. And hers? Mine is the same, Mara said. Hennessy stood. He put his hat back on his head and adjusted the brim with 2 fingers, the precise, finicky gesture of a man who needs a moment to decide what he's going to say next. There are men in this town, he said, who remember the Calloway place, the family that lived 2 miles north of Vance's homestead on the North Fork. The youngest girl died of a snake bite that summer. She was 9 years old, and she had been over to Vance's place the week before. The surgery was quiet. A snake bite, Mara said. That's what I said. A 9-year-old child died of a snake bite in Wyoming Territory, in the summer. And you're telling me that? I'm telling you what people remember. People remember what they're told to remember, Mr. Hennessy. A child died of a snake bite because children in this territory die of snake bites. That is a thing that happens in a place where rattlesnakes exist. It has nothing to do with Rowan Vance. The child had been to his property. Half the children in this county have been on one property or another. Are you going to put a curse on all of them? Hennessy looked at her for a long moment. His face was not unkind exactly. It was the face of a man who has decided on a thing and is now doing the work of believing it was the right decision. I'm going to tell you something, Miss Quinn, and I'm going to tell it to you plain. There are good men in this town who will not wait much longer. That's not a threat from me. That's a fact about them. I would hate for you to be in that building when they stop waiting. He walked out. Crane sat at his desk and looked at his folded hands. Mara stood in the doorway and listened to the bell above the front door ring once and go still. He means it, Crane said. About the men. I know he means it. Mara. He looked up at her. I can't protect this building forever. I'm an old man with a medical practice, not a sheriff, and the sheriff, in case you hadn't noticed, has been remarkably absent from this entire conversation. Briggs is Hennessy's man. Briggs is everybody's man who pays him enough. Yes. He rubbed his face with both hands. How much longer does Vance need? 3 more days, maybe 4, if the lung doesn't clear faster. 3 days, Crane said, like he was measuring the weight of it. 3 days. He nodded, once, and picked up the journal on his desk and opened it, which was his way of ending a conversation, and Mara went back into the surgery and closed the door. Vance was sitting up, not lying down. Sitting up with his back against the surgery wall and his long legs stretched out on the cot and the medical notebook in his lap, the one she had left on the side table. He was reading it. She stopped. That's my notebook. It is. He did not look up immediately. He turned 1 more page. Then he closed it and looked at her. You've been thorough. Give me that. He held it out and she took it and set it back on the table and pulled the stool to the cot and sat down and looked at him. He looked better than he had 3 days ago. The color was back in his face, and the sickness had burned off some of the remote quality he carried, that distance that had probably been there so long he did not know it was a thing he did. He looked, this morning, like a man who was thinking hard about something and had not yet decided whether to say it. Hennessy, he said. You heard. Walls are thin. He looked at his left hand, the 2 frostbitten fingers, which were wrapped in clean linen. He flexed them slowly, testing. He's going to move. Not for 3 days. He'll move before 3 days if something pushes him. Then nothing will push him. Vance looked at her directly. Mara, I need to tell you something. She waited. I have a homestead on the North Fork, 8 miles into the high country. I've had it for 4 years. It's not much. A cabin, a barn that doesn't leak too badly, about 40 acres of bottomland along the creek. I've been running cattle up there in the summer and wintering in the lower country, but last year I stopped coming down. He paused. I stopped coming down because every time I came down it went like it went when I rode in for salt last week. People in the road, men with their hands near their guns, that kind of coming down. I know about the homestead. Do you know it's mine, clear and legal? Deed recorded in Cheyenne in '81. I didn't know that specifically. It's mine. Nobody can put me off it legally, but legally and actually are two different weights out here, and you know that. He looked at the covered window. When I'm well enough to ride, I'm going back up there. And I'm going to stay up there. And whatever Hennessy wants to do after that is between him and an empty town. She looked at her notebook on the table. I'm coming with you, she said. The surgery was very quiet. No, he said. Yes. Mara, I have 6 causes of death in that notebook, Rowan. 6 clear, separate, medically and circumstantially explicable causes of death that have nothing to do with you except that you were in the same territory when they happened. I have Agnes Fremont's lie about Anna, which I can support with the old doctor's records because Crane has them in his files and I've already checked. I have Ruth's coroner report from '78, which lists cause of death as lightning strike with no secondary factors. I have Dolores's crossing, which 3 men witnessed and which the foreman of the Sutherland Ranch confirmed in writing in a letter to the county recorder that you were at the ranch that day and could not have been at the river. She stopped. Do you understand what I'm saying? You're saying you've been building a case. I'm saying I've built a case, past tense. It's done. What I need now is to go to where you've been and see what I can find to complete it. The Calloway girl, the snakebite. I want to talk to the Calloway family. I want to see the records, if there are any, from your land. I want to see what a man's actual life looks like when you take the story the town built around it and hold it up against the facts. He looked at her for a long time. You'd be alone up there with me, 8 miles from town. I'm aware of the geography. People will say what they say, Rowan. They've been saying things about me since I was 18 years old and taller than every boy in the county and strong enough to lift a man out of a river. I have stopped caring what they say. I stopped caring so long ago I can't remember when it was. It's not just talk. If you come up there with me and Hennessy decides to move, you're 8 miles from any help. You're 8 miles from Crane. You'd be there. Something crossed his face that she couldn't name. I am not a safe thing to be near, he said. I know you don't believe that, but I have believed it long enough that it lives in me like a bone now, and I don't know how to take it out. Then I'll take it out, she said. That's rather the point. He looked at his hands. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at her. 3 more days, he said. 3 days, she agreed. She picked up the notebook and opened it, and the surgery settled back into its ordinary sounds, the stove and the wind and the birds on the roof, and neither of them said anything more. But the decision was made, and they both knew it. She told Crane that evening. He was washing instruments at the surgery sink, working methodically through the tray the way he did every evening, and she stood in the doorway and told him plainly the way she told him most things. He did not stop washing the instruments. For how long? He said. I don't know. Until I have what I need. And what do you need? The Calloway family. I want to talk to them, and I want to see what his life actually looks like when someone's looking at it straight. Crane set a scalpel in the drying tray. He picked up the next instrument. He's a solitary man, Crane said. He's been alone up there a long time. That does things to a person. I know. You've known him 6 days. I've known of him 8 years, and I've spent 6 days taking his history while he was sick enough to tell it true. I know him well enough. You know his medical history. Eldon. She came fully into the room. I am not a young girl going up a mountain after a man who caught her fancy. You know me better than that. He was quiet for a moment. I do, he said. Then trust what you know. He set the last instrument in the tray and turned and looked at her, and his face was the face of a man who has run out of professional objections and is now dealing with the older, less rational kind. I'll send Tom Bidwell up with supplies every 2 weeks, he said, and if I don't hear from you in that time, I'll come myself. That's fair. It is not fair. It is me making the best of a thing I cannot stop. He turned back to the sink. Tell Vance if he lets anything happen to you, I will personally ensure his medical treatment is as uncomfortable as possible for the rest of his natural life. I'll tell him. He won't think it's funny. No, she agreed. But I will. They left on the 4th morning before Bitter Hollow was properly awake. She had packed 2 bags, her medical bag, the black one, and a canvas sack with her notebooks and her father's anatomy and a change of clothes and the things a woman needs that nobody writes down in supply lists. Rowan's black gelding had been in Crane's barn, fed and rested and inclined toward forgiveness, And she had her own horse, a stocky bay mare named Frances, who had strong opinions about mud and no opinions about anything else. The trail north out of town went behind the smithy and up along the dry creek bed and into the cottonwoods before it climbed the first ridge, and they took it in the gray pre-dawn with the cold sitting on the ground like something poured there. She could see her breath, and Frances's breath, and the gelding's breath all tangled together in the still air. They did not speak for the first mile. She had not expected to. There's a particular silence that comes at the start of a thing that cannot be undone, and they were both in it, and she thought it was better to let it be what it was than to fill it up with words before the words were needed. At the top of the first ridge, the town was visible below them, the thin smoke from the morning fires beginning to go up from the chimneys, the main street still dark and empty. She stopped her horse for a moment and looked at it. 8 years. She had come here with a dead father's address and a medical bag and the absolute necessity of employment, and she had built something here, in the surgery and in the work, and in the small, hard daily fact of being present and competent and necessary. And she was leaving it this morning on a horse behind a man the town had spent years trying to make into something he wasn't. She looked at it for a moment, then she turned Frances north and rode. Vance pulled up beside her on the ridgeline without comment. He had seen her stop, and he had stopped, and now he was riding again because she was. And there was something in that, in the simple way he matched his pace to hers without asking her to explain the pause, that she tucked away without examining it yet. "The Calloway place is off the East Fork," she said. "We can reach it by midday if we push." "The family's still there?" "Far as I know. The father, at least. The mother died 2 years ago." "Of what?" "Winter fever." She glanced at him. "Before you ask, I know. I attended her. It was winter fever. Something at the corner of his mouth." "You think I was going to say I probably caused that too?" "I thought it might occur to you." "It occurred to me." "That is precisely the kind of thinking I am going to spend the next several weeks dismantling. So you may as well start practicing not having it." He looked ahead up the trail. The mountains were beginning to come visible over the ridge, the high peaks still dark against a sky that was starting to go pale at the eastern edge. "You're a strange woman, Mara Quinn," he said, not unkindly. "I've been told that." "Who told you?" "Everyone I've ever met." He was quiet. Then, "They were wrong about the strange part. I think you might be the least strange person I've met in the Wyoming Territory." She did not answer that, but she felt it land somewhere in her chest and stay there, small and warm, and she did not take it out and look at it, but she did not put it away either. They rode north through the cold morning with the mountains coming up white against the sky ahead of them, and the town of Bitter Hollow going smaller and smaller behind, and the trail narrowing as it climbed, and the only sounds were the horses and the wind and the occasional complaint of a magpie in the pines. And somewhere up ahead, 8 miles in a truth she intended to find, the North Fork ran cold and clear over its rocks, like it had been running since before there was anyone to watch it. The Calloway place sat at the end of a rutted track off the East Fork, a low-roofed homestead with a sagging porch, and a barn that had lost its doors sometime in the last decade and never gotten new ones. A thin thread of smoke came from the chimney. A dog chained near the porch stood up and barked twice, and then sat back down, apparently satisfied with its own effort. Mara tied Frances to the fence post and looked at Vance. "Wait here," she said. "Mara, if he sees you first, this conversation is over before it starts." He stayed with the horses. She went up the porch steps and knocked, and after a long minute the door opened and a man stood in it who had once been large and was now the kind of large that has gone slack and tired. Silas Calloway. 50, maybe 55. Eyes the color of old wood, set deep in a face that had been worked over by weather and something else, something interior, the long, slow damage of a grief he had never properly put down. "Mr. Calloway." He looked at her. "Miss Quinn, I'm sorry to come without notice. I'd like to talk to you, if you're willing, about Lily." Something moved across his face like a shutter briefly opening. Then it closed again. "Come in," he said. The inside of the cabin was dim and smelled of bacon grease and old wood, and a particular dusty sadness that accumulates in rooms where one person has been alone a long time. She sat at the table where he pointed, and he poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove and sat across from her and wrapped his hands around his cup and waited. "I'm going to ask you something straight," she said, and I want you to answer it the same way. All right. When Lily died, the snake bite, was there anything at all that you saw or knew or believed in your own mind, separate from what people told you afterward, that made you think Rowan Vance had anything to do with it? Silas Calloway looked at his coffee for a long time. No, he said. Tell me what you remember. He told her. Lily had been 9 and curious and fast on her feet, the way certain children are, the kind that are always somewhere slightly beyond where you last saw them. She had gone over to the Vance property 3 times that summer, drawn by the horses. Vance had let her come, had put her up on the black gelding once, walking the horse around the yard while the girl laughed. That was what Calloway had seen with his own eyes, a man being patient with a child who liked horses. She had died in August, not on Vance's property. On the trail between the 2 homesteads, in the tall grass on the east side of the creek, where the rattlesnakes came down from the rocks in the evening to lie in the warmth the ground held after a hot day. The doctor had confirmed the bite marks. There had been no ambiguity. Then why? Mara said, not harshly, genuinely asking. Calloway turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. Because I needed it to be something, he said. Because 9 years old is not a thing a man can just accept. And Hennessy came to me that week and he said, you know that man your daughter was visiting? And I said yes. And he told me the story, the whole story. All 7. He stopped. And it was easier to have a place to put it. The cabin was very quiet. I'm sorry, Mara said. About Lily, I mean that. I know you do. He looked at his hands. Is he with you, Vance? He's outside. Calloway nodded slowly. He stood up and went to the window and looked out for a moment. And she watched his profile, the old weight of it. He sent a letter, Calloway said. After she died. 2 pages. In a hand that looked like a man who hadn't written much in a while. He said he was sorry. He said she had a good seat on a horse, naturally, without being told. He said he was glad he'd known her. He turned from the window. Hennessy told me to burn it. He said it was the letter of a guilty man covering himself. Did you burn it? No. He was quiet for a moment. I kept it. It's in the box with her things. Mara wrote in her notebook. She wrote carefully, the date and the facts and Calloway's account in his own words, and she wrote it the way her father had taught her, without editorializing, just the plain weight of it on the page. When she was done, she closed the notebook and stood and held out her hand, and Silas Calloway looked at it for a moment and then shook it, his grip firm and dry. Miss Quinn, he said, what you're doing. Does it change anything? In town? I don't know, she said, but it changes what's written down. And that's a start. She walked back out to the horses. Rowan was standing with his back to the cabin, looking north up the valley toward the mountains, and he turned when he heard her on the porch steps. She could see him reading her face the way he had learned to read it over the last 6 days, looking for the particular quality of her expression that told him where things stood. Snakebite, she said, in the tall grass on the east trail. No connection to you or your property. The father knows it. He looked at her. He never blamed me, Vance said slowly. He let himself be told a story. There's a difference. She put the notebook in her saddlebag and untied Francis. He kept your letter, Rowan. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned and untied the gelding and mounted. And she mounted, and they rode north without speaking, and she let him have the silence, because some things require it. The homestead on the North Fork was not what she had expected, and she had not expected much. It was a 2-room cabin built of pine logs that had been cut and fit with someone's genuine care, the corners tight, the roof steeply pitched against the mountain snow. A stone chimney on the south end, a barn behind with a solid roof, as he had said, and a small paddock built from split rails, and beyond the paddock, the North Fork running clear and cold over a bed of smooth rocks, catching the pale November light. It was cold up here, colder than town, the cold of elevation that has nothing to do with season and everything to do with altitude. Her breath came out in long plumes as she unsaddled Francis and got her into the paddock, and she stood for a moment with her hands on the mare's back and looked up at the mountains that stood above the cabin's roof, the high peaks white, the lower ridges dark with pine. It was very quiet, not the quiet of a town at 3 a.m, the real quiet, the kind that doesn't have any human noise underneath it, "I'll get a fire going," Vance said behind her. Inside, the cabin was cold but not damp. There was a good cast iron stove and a supply of cut wood stacked against the wall, more than enough. And a table and 2 chairs and a bunk built into the north wall, and a second room behind a plank door with a second bunk, and the accumulated gear of a man who has been living alone in the mountains. He built the fire without ceremony, and it caught fast, the dry pine taking immediately, and inside 20 minutes the front room had lost its worst cold. She looked around while the fire built. The cabin was spare but not neglected. The floor had been swept recently, which surprised her. There were books on a shelf above the table, 5 of them, their spines cracked with use. A medical text she didn't recognize, a surveying manual, 2 dime novels with their covers worn off, and a King James Bible which she noted and did not comment on. On the wall beside the stove, a single piece of paper pinned with a nail. She looked closer. It was a child's drawing. Pencil and a little color from what looked like crushed berries, rough and joyful. A horse with a round body and too many legs and a small figure on its back with a great arc of a smile. At the bottom, in the large, careful letters of a child learning them, Lily and Midnight. She stood and looked at it for a long time. "She gave it to me the last time she came," Vance said from the stove. He was not looking at her. "Week before she died." "You kept it up?" "Yes." She turned away from the wall and sat at the table and opened her notebook, because that was what she had come here to do, and she would feel the weight of the drawing later when she was not working. They settled into a kind of order over the following days that neither of them designed and neither of them named. She worked in the mornings. She had written to Doc Crane before leaving, and Crane had sent back with Tom Bidwell not only the supplies he had promised, but a packet of records from his files, the old doctor's notes on Anna's labor and death, the county coroner's reports on Ruth and on Dolores, 3 letters in the county recorder's archive related to the Powder River crossing. Crane had written a note that said only, "Be careful and be thorough. I have told Hennessy you are conducting a medical survey of the North Fork area. He doesn't believe me, but it gives him a reason not to act yet." She worked through the records systematically, building the case the way her father had taught her to build a diagnosis, ruling out first what it wasn't, closing doors until only the true cause remained standing. Agnes Fremont's account of Anna's labor fell apart against the old doctor's notes, which recorded in his cramped hand that he had been sent for too late and had found the patient already in extremis upon arrival. The coroner's report on Ruth used the word instantaneous and noted the burn pattern on the ground around the point of impact. A burn pattern consistent with a single direct strike from overhead and inconsistent with anything else. Dolores's crossing was the simplest of all, confirmed by 3 names in the foreman's letter who had seen her take the wrong ford. Each one she wrote up clean and full, cause and evidence and source. The way a thing needs to be written when you intend it to survive being argued with. Vance did not interfere with her work. He did his own work. The work of a man keeping a homestead through the winter, which was continuous and physical and largely silent. He split wood. He checked the barn roof and replaced 2 boards that had cracked in the last freeze. He tended the horses. He cooked in the evenings with the competent, unshowy manner of a man who has fed himself alone for years and has reduced it to mechanics. They talked in the evenings, not about the case. She made a point of closing the notebook when the fire went low and the day's work was done, because she had learned already that the case was not the thing that needed air after dark. What needed air after dark was the rest of it, the parts of 8 years that she asked about carefully, and he answered with the same flat precision he gave everything, taking his time, not dressing things up. One evening, the 4th or 5th, she asked him why he had kept coming back to Bitter Hollow at all, after the 4th or 5th death, when the town was already what it was about him. He was quiet for a long time, looking at the fire. "Because it's the nearest supply," he said first, and she made a face at him, and he almost smiled. "And because every time I came back I was hoping it had changed, that it would be different, that people would have gotten tired of the story." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "That's a stupid thing to hope for. I know that now. It's a human thing to hope for. Same category most of the time." She looked at him across the fire. The lamplight was doing the thing it did in the evenings, pulling the planes of his face out of the shadow, and she had stopped pretending she didn't notice the particulars of his face some days ago. "Why didn't you leave the territory entirely?" she said. "Because this is my land." Simple. Immediate. Because I built that barn with my hands and I dug the well in the yard and I cut every log in this cabin. Because running from a story doesn't kill the story, it just gives it better legs. He paused. And because I have nowhere else. She did not push on the last part. She understood it. She had nowhere else either. They were on the 8th day when Tom Bidwell came up the trail at a pace that told her it wasn't a supply visit. She heard the horse from inside the cabin and was at the door before he reached the paddock, and she read his face before he said a word. He was 17 and had his mother's wide eyes, and he was pale under his freckles in a way that was not from the cold. "Miss Quinn." He pulled up and swung down. Hennessy moved. She waited. "Last night, he got the Bidwell cousins and 3 of the Sutherland hands and 2 men I didn't know, and they went to Doc Crane and told him that if you weren't back in town by the end of the week, they were coming up here to bring you back themselves." Tom was breathing fast, the way people breathe when they've been carrying something bad for a long ride. Doc Crane told them he'd have the law on them. Sheriff Briggs was standing right there, and he didn't say a word. Of course he didn't. "Miss Quinn, they were talking about burning the homestead. I heard it. Mart Bidwell said it plain that if Vance wouldn't go on his own, then he'd go because there'd be nothing left to come back to." She turned. Vance was standing behind her in the cabin doorway. He had heard. His face was the same face it always was, that particular stillness. But she had learned the stillness well enough now to see what was under it, and what was under it was a man who had heard this before, and had believed for years that the only answer to it was to give ground until there was no ground left. "How many?" he said to Tom. 8, maybe 9. Armed. Mart Bidwell had his rifle, some of the others. Vance looked at Mara. She looked back at him. "How long?" she said to Tom. "Before they come?" 2 days. Maybe 3. Hennessy said end of the week, and the weekend's Friday. She stepped back into the cabin and went to the table and opened the notebook and looked at what was written there. 6 accounts, 6 causes, all of it sourced and documented. She looked at the drawing on the wall, the round horse, and the too many legs, and Lily's name in big proud letters at the bottom. She looked at Rowan Vance in the doorway. "I have 2 days," she said, "to finish this and get it in writing that survives." "Mara," his voice was very quiet, "that notebook won't stop 8 armed men." "No," she agreed, "but it'll survive them, and that's different." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at Tom, and then he looked north up the valley at the mountains that had been there since before there were stories and would be there long after every story was gone. "Then we finish it," he said, "and then we deal with what comes." She was already writing. Tom Bidwell spent the night in the barn. Mara had told him to go back, that there was no reason for him to be here when the trouble came, and he had looked at her with his mother's wide eyes and said, with the particular stubbornness of a 17-year-old who has decided to be a man about something, that Doc Crane had told him to stay until he was sure she was all right. She had looked at him for a moment and then said, "Fine, sleep in the barn," and handed him an extra blanket. She worked until midnight. Vance sat at the other end of the table with the surveying manual open in front of him, not reading it, watching her write. And she had stopped noticing his watching some days ago, the way you stop noticing a sound that has been in the room long enough to belong there. The document she was building was not the notebook. The notebook was her working record, the raw material. What she was building now was something different, a clean, formal account in her best hand, every death listed by name and date, followed by cause, followed by evidence, followed by source. Clara Vance, cholera, summer of 1874, documented by the Missouri County Health Records and consistent with the epidemic of that season affecting the entire region. Dolores Vance, drowning, spring flood of 1876, witnessed by 3 named individuals who confirmed the subject's location at the time of death. Ruth Vance, lightning strike, August 1878, coroner's report on file with the county, burn pattern and injury consistent with direct overhead strike. Anna Vance, childbed fever, February 1881, medical record by the attending physician confirming the patient was beyond intervention upon his arrival, contradicting the account of the attending midwife. He went through each one, her pen moving steadily, and when she had written all 6, she wrote a 7th entry. Vera Vance departed the homestead voluntarily, of her own will and stated intention, September 1885. Died of internal cancer, February 1886, per the attending physician's letter to R. Vance. Diagnosis estimated to predate her marriage. Cause of death? Disease, pre-existing. Connection to R. Vance? None. She read it back. Then she wrote at the top of the first page, in the large clear letters she used for headings, a medical and circumstantial account of the deaths, associated with Rowan Vance, North Fork, Wyoming Territory, prepared by Mara Quinn, assistant to Dr. Eldon Crane, November 1886. And below that, because she was her father's daughter, and he had taught her that the purpose of a document was not just to record but to argue, she wrote one more line. In no case examined does the evidence support a conclusion other than natural or accidental cause. The association of these deaths with any single individual is not supported by fact, and the persistence of that association in public belief represents a failure of reason that this account is intended to correct. She set the pen down. Vance looked across the table at her. Done, she said. All of it. All of it. She stacked the pages and pressed them flat with her palm. I'm going to make a second copy in the morning. One stays here. One goes to Crane, and Crane sends it to the county recorder in Cheyenne. If Hennessy gets here before Crane gets it to Cheyenne, then the copy that stays here survives the visit, and I send it myself afterward. She met his eyes. Documents don't burn as easy as people think. You have to want to burn every copy. He looked at the stack of pages under her hand. Mara, he said, what you've done here. I want you to know that I understand what it cost. It didn't cost much. It cost time and ink. That's not what I mean. She looked at him. The fire had burned down to a good bed of coals, and the lamplight was soft, and the cabin was warm in the way a small space gets warm when two people have been living in it for more than a week, a warmth that is partly temperature and partly something less quantifiable. I know what you mean, she said, and you're welcome. He almost said something else. She could see him weighing it the way he weighed most things, carefully, not wanting to put it down wrong. Then he said, You should sleep. You've been at this since morning. So have you. I wasn't writing all day. No, you were splitting wood and checking roof boards and cooking dinner and doing 12 other things. That is also a day's work, Rowan. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he got up and banked the stove, and she took the document to the second room where her bunk was and put it under the mattress, which was not particularly subtle, but was the place she thought of first, and she was too tired for cleverness. She lay in the dark and listened to the North Fork running over its rocks outside. And she thought about the document under her and what it meant. And she thought about the fact that meaning a thing on paper and having it mean the same thing in the world were two entirely different propositions, and the distance between them was 8 armed men in 2 days. She slept anyway. There was nothing else useful to do. She made the second copy in the morning while Vance saddled Tom's horse and checked the boy's saddlebags and gave him a list of things to tell Crane, precise and detailed, the way a man gives instructions when he knows they matter. Tom stood in the yard listening with his hat in his hands and his face doing the work of looking calm. Tell him the document is complete and a copy is going to Cheyenne, Vance said. Tell him we are not leaving the homestead. Tell him if he can get word to the county sheriff in Laramie, not Briggs, Laramie. That would be useful. Tell him we have 2 rifles and enough ammunition to make a prolonged visit inconvenient for everybody. Tom blinked. 2 rifles. Mine and Miss Quinn's. Tom looked at Mara, who was coming out of the cabin with the second copy folded and wrapped in oilcloth. You have a rifle, Tom said to her. My father's. Springfield, 1863. It shoots fine. She handed him the oilcloth packet. This goes inside your shirt, Tom. Not in the saddlebag. Inside your shirt, and you keep it there until you hand it to Crane personally. Yes, ma'am. If anyone stops you on the trail and asks what you're carrying a letter from me to Doc Crane about a patient, which is true. Yes, ma'am. She looked at him. He was 17 and trying very hard, and she thought of all the things she could say to him about what was going to happen in the next 2 days and decided against all of them. You're a good boy, Tom, she said instead. Your mother raised you right. He went red under his freckles and put his hat on and got on his horse and rode south down the valley trail, and they watched him until the pines swallowed him, And then they were alone on the homestead with the mountains behind them and 2 days in front of them, and the knowledge, shared and unspoken, that what came next was going to be what it was going to be regardless of what they did to prepare for it. "Show me where you keep the ammunition," she said. The first day passed in preparation. Vance knew his property the way a man knows a thing he has built and tended, every angle and approach, every line of sight, every place where the trail came out of the trees into the open, and every place where it stayed covered. He showed her all of it, walking the perimeter of the homestead in the cold afternoon while she listened and asked questions, and she understood, watching him, that this was a man who had not simply been the passive subject of other people's fear. He had been thinking about this moment, or a moment like this, for years. He had thought about it the way you think about a thing you hope never comes but cannot stop your mind from rehearsing. The cabin had 2 windows, north and south. The barn was set back and to the east, which gave a natural anchor point for anyone approaching from the tree line. The paddock fence ran along the west side of the yard, and beyond the fence the ground sloped down to the creek, and anyone coming from the west had to cross the creek first, which in November ran cold and fast enough to make a man think. They moved the horses from the paddock into the barn and closed the barn doors. They brought in water and stacked more wood inside the cabin. Mara loaded the Springfield and set it by the south window, and loaded Vance's rifle and set it by the north. She checked both and checked them again, which was a habit her father had given her about firearms and about most things, and Vance watched her do it without comment. In the evening, they sat at the table and ate the last of the beans she had put on that morning, and the fire in the stove was good and hot, and for a little while it was possible to sit in the warmth of it and let the 2 days feel longer than they were. "Tell me something," she said. "Something that has nothing to do with any of this." He looked at her across the table. "What kind of something? Anything. Something from before. Before the territory, before Wyoming? Something that was just a thing that happened and had no weight to it." He thought about it. He turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. "When I was 12, he said, "my father had a mule named Persimmon. Persimmon was the worst animal I have ever known, and I have known some bad animals. He bit, he kicked, he sat down in harness whenever he decided the work was beneath him, which was always, and he had an expression on his face like a man who has been cheated at cards and is still composing his response." He paused. "My father loved that mule. Completely, unreasonably. Used to talk to him. Sat with him when he was sick. When Persimmon died, my father cried, which was the only time I ever saw my father cry. And I remember thinking at the time that it seemed like a strange animal to love that much." He was quiet for a moment. "And now," Mara said, "now I think I understand it better. The things that are difficult to love are sometimes the ones you love the most, because it costs something. And a thing that costs something means something." She looked at him across the table and did not say anything, and he looked back at her and did not look away, and the fire made its small sounds in the stove, and outside the North Fork ran over its rocks, and the mountains stood up in the dark and held the sky where it belonged. They came on the second night. She heard them first, or heard the horses first, which was the same thing, the particular sound of shod hooves on frozen ground coming up the valley trail from the south. She was awake and at the south window before she was fully conscious of having moved. 8 horses. She counted the shapes at the tree line where the trail opened into the yard. 8 riders spread loose, the way riders spread when they don't want to be a single target, which told her something about their intentions that she had already known, but now knew with her body rather than her mind. She turned. Vance was already up, already at the north window, the rifle across his forearms. "South," she said quietly. "I see them. 8. I count 9. She looked again. He was right. There was a rider hanging back at the tree line, staying in the shadow. She could not make out the face. They waited. The lead rider came into the yard, and she knew him by the horse, the Dunmare Hennessy always rode. Steady and middle-aged and reliable. The horse of a man who trusted comfort over speed. He pulled up 20 feet from the cabin door and sat there for a moment, and then called out, not loud, the specific controlled volume of a man who wants to be heard without sounding afraid. "Vance, come out!" Silence. "Vance, we know you're in there. Lights on. Come out and let's talk like reasonable people." Mara moved to the door. Vance caught her arm. "Let me," he said. "No." She looked at him. You go out there and they see you, it becomes what they already decided it is. I go out. It's different. It's not safer. I didn't say it was safer. I said it was different. She pulled her arm free, not roughly. Cover the door. She opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit her face immediately, the sharp, specific cold of a November night at elevation, and she stood in it and looked at the 9 horsemen in her yard and felt, running under the fear in a thin, bright line, something that was close to fury. "Mr. Hennessy," she said. A pause. The men shifted in their saddles. "Miss Quinn." Hennessy's voice was careful. "We're not here for you. Step away from the cabin and this doesn't concern you. This is my cabin as much as his. I've been living in it for 10 days. It concerns me considerably. Step away." "I won't." She came down one porch step. She could see their faces better now, the lantern light from the window reaching out into the yard. Hennessy in front. Mart Bidwell to his left, the rifle across his saddle. 2 of the Sutherland hands, younger men, and she could see on their faces the particular expression of men who have gone further into a thing than they intended and are not quite sure how to go back. The 2 strangers in the rear, their faces in shadow, and the 9th rider still at the tree line, still not moving. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to listen to it." "Miss Quinn, I want to tell you something, Mr. Hennessy, and then you can do what you came to do, but you'll hear it first." The yard was quiet. The horses breathed steam. "I have spent the last 3 weeks investigating the deaths of every woman this man has been associated with. Everyone. I have medical records and coroner's reports and witness accounts and the written testimony of a county foreman and the verbal account of a grieving father, and what I have found, written down in full and already on its way to the county recorder in Cheyenne, is that not one of those women died of anything other than what kills women in this territory every year. Cholera, flood, lightning, childbed fever, disease, accident, every single one with a cause that has nothing to do with the man you rode up here to drive out." She paused. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. "You have spent years telling a story about a cursed man because stories are easier than causes. Because childbed fever needs a face to blame, and a lightning strike needs a reason, and a flood is more bearable if there is somebody standing behind it. I understand that. I am a doctor's assistant, and I have been in the room when people needed reasons for unbearable things, and I understand the hunger for them. But understanding a hunger doesn't make the thing you're feeding it worth eating." Mart Bidwell shifted the rifle on his saddle. She looked at him directly. "Mart Bidwell, your cousin Tom is the best young man in this county. He is 17 and he rode up here and spent a night in a cold barn because someone had to, and it was him. Whatever you think you're doing tonight, think about what Tom would say if he was standing here." Bidwell's jaw worked. He did not raise the rifle. She looked back at Hennessy. "I'm asking you to go back down that trail," she said. "Not for him, for yourselves. Because the story you've been building for 7 years is made of nothing, and burning a man's homestead to protect it doesn't make it true. It just makes you the kind of men who burned a homestead." The silence that followed was the particular silence of people who have been told something they cannot immediately refute and cannot immediately accept. Then the cabin door opened behind her and Rowan Vance stepped out onto the porch. He stood behind her and to her left, the rifle held across his body. Not raised, not pointing, just held. And she felt rather than heard him there, the specific weight of his presence, and she did not step aside and she did not step back. The 9th rider at the tree line moved, came forward, out of the shadow, and into the edge of the lantern light, and Mara looked and felt a cold that was not the November air move through her. It was Sheriff Briggs. She had not expected Briggs to be among them. Briggs was Hennessy's man. She had known that, but she had thought Hennessy would keep him at arm's length from this, keep his hands clean, and instead here was the badge and the horse, and the face that had been avoiding this situation for 10 days, coming out of the shadow at the worst possible moment. Briggs rode up to the front and stopped his horse next to Hennessy's and looked at her and then at Vance, and then at the rifle across Vance's arms. "Vance," he said, "put that down. I'll put it down when your men leave my property." "Your property." Briggs said it with a flat, dismissive weight. "You've been nothing but trouble in this county for 7 years. I've been a man living on his legal land, Sheriff. If that's trouble, you've got a narrow definition of peace." Briggs looked at Mara. "Miss Quinn, I'm going to ask you one more time to step back. And I'm going to tell you one more time that I won't. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I'm going to tell you that the document I referenced is already in transit to Cheyenne, and that I sent a second letter the same night to the county sheriff in Laramie. Not to you, to Laramie, with a full account of the situation at this homestead and the names of the men I expected to be involved. Briggs went very still. And I want to tell you something else, she continued. That document names names. It names who told what story, and who repeated it, and who used it to build a case for driving a man off his legal land. It names Agnes Fremont, and what she said about Anna Vance, and what the actual records say. It names the Powder River account, and the 3 witnesses the foreman wrote down. It names the coroner's report on Ruth. All of it is in writing, and all of it is already somewhere you cannot reach it. It was a gamble. She knew it was a gamble. The letter to Laramie was real, but whether Laramie would act and how fast, and whether it mattered before tonight resolved itself one way or another, she could not know. She was betting on the weight of uncertainty, on the way men who are doing a wrong thing become cautious when they think it might be recorded. She watched Briggs calculate. She watched Hennessy calculate behind him. Mart Bidwell had taken his hand off the rifle. The 2 Sutherland hands looked at each other in the way that young men look at each other when they want permission to leave. It did not end cleanly. That is the true shape of most things, that they do not end cleanly. They end in the slow, reluctant untangling of men who came ready for one thing and found another. Hennessy said something to Briggs in a low voice she could not hear. Briggs sat his horse for a long moment, his jaw set, looking at her and then at Vance and then at the rifle that had not moved from where it was held. Then he turned his horse. He did not say anything. He turned his horse and rode back to the tree line and stopped there. And after a moment, Hennessy turned his dun mare and followed, and the Sutherland hands went almost immediately, the relief on their faces visible even in the dark, and Mart Bidwell last, taking his time about it, but going. They stood in the yard and watched the 9 horses go down the valley trail and into the dark. Mara's legs were shaking. She had not noticed them shaking while it was happening, and now that it was over, they shook with the particular violence of things that have been held still too long. She put one hand on the porch rail and held it and breathed. Vance's hand came down on her shoulder. Not a grip, just a weight, present and steady and warm through the wool of her coat. You knew about the Laramie letter, he said. Yes. You didn't tell me. I was going to tell you this morning, and then the morning was busy. He was quiet for a moment. Then, they might come back. They might. She straightened up and took her hand off the rail. But not tonight. Tonight they went back down the trail, and a night is enough to let men think. And men who are thinking are less useful to Hennessy than men who are moving. She looked at him. And Briggs knows his name is in a letter to Laramie now. That matters to a man who has a badge, even a bad one. He looked at her in the way that he had been looking at her more frequently over the last several days, the particular quality of a man looking at something he has decided to stop pretending he is not looking at. You planned that, he said. I planned for the possibility of it. From the beginning. From the surgery, when Hennessy told Crane he'd wait until the end of the week, she pushed the Springfield safety on with her thumb and held it against her side. I told you, Rowan, not a curse. Arithmetic. You plan for the numbers that are actually in front of you. He looked at her for a long moment in the cold yard, with the mountains above them and the North Fork running below them and the thin cold stars spread out over everything. And then he did something she had not seen him do once in all the days she had known him. He laughed, not loudly, not the performance of laughter, a real one, short and rough and surprised. The laugh of a man who has been through something ridiculous and difficult and finds, on the other side of it, that he is still standing and that someone standing next to him is also still standing, and that this is funnier and stranger and more welcome than he has the words for. She looked at him laughing in the dark yard and felt something in her chest open, not dramatically, not like a door blowing off its hinges, but the way a door opens when someone who has been knocking a long time finally just turns the handle and walks in. Doc Crane arrived 4 days later. He came on his own horse with Tom Bidwell behind him and a man Mara did not recognize riding beside him. A lean man in a county coat with the easy, uninvested manner of a bureaucrat who has been sent to observe rather than to act. She met them at the paddock fence. The man from Laramie, Crane said, with the tone he used for all information he was delivering under protest. Arrived in Bitter Hollow 2 days ago. He has spoken with Briggs, who has a sudden and vigorous memory of not being present at any homestead on the North Fork. He has spoken with Hennessy, who similarly has found his memory of recent events to be incomplete. He would like to speak with you. The man from Laramie looked at her and said, Miss Quinn, I've read your letter. Good. It makes a number of specific allegations. They're not allegations, they're documented facts. I have the document inside if you'd like to read it. I would. She brought him in. Vance was at the table and he stood when they came in, and the man from Laramie looked at him the way a man looks at something he has heard a great deal about and is now measuring against the hard about version. Whatever he concluded, he did not share it. He sat at the table and she put the document in front of him, and he read it while she stood and Vance stood, and Crane sat, and Tom leaned against the wall trying to be invisible. The man from Laramie read slowly. He turned every page with a specific care that meant he was actually reading and not performing it. Twice he went back to a previous page. Once he looked up and said, Agnes Fremont, and she said, Agnes Fremont. And he wrote something in his own notebook and went back to reading. When he was done, he closed the document and folded his hands on top of it. This is thorough work, he said. Thank you. It's also work that should have been done 7 years ago by someone whose actual job it was to do it. Yes, she said. It should have been. He looked at Vance. Mr. Vance, are you intending to make a formal complaint against any named individual in this account? Vance was quiet for a moment. No, he said. The man from Laramie nodded, as if this was the answer he had expected, and it told him something. What I can do, he said, is enter this document into the county record, which means it becomes the official account and supersedes anything previously entered or publicly stated. I can also make it known in Bitter Hollow, through official channels, that the county has reviewed the matter and found no basis for the association of Mr. Vance's name with the deaths in question. That will not change every mind, but it changes what is officially true, and officially true has a weight in towns like this, whether people admit it or not. That's what we're asking for, Mara said. He looked at her. Miss Quinn, I want to ask you something. Why you? I beg your pardon? Why did you do this? It's not your job. It was not asked of you. The man was a stranger to you. Why you and not anyone else in that town in 7 years? She thought about it. She thought about the 8 years in the surgery and the things she had been called and the things she had let wash off her and the things she had not. She thought about her father in St. Joseph teaching her to read and then teaching her to think and then dying and leaving her his bag and his conviction that the truth was worth the trouble of finding it even when nobody asked you to find it. Because I was there, she said, and I knew how to look, and no one else was doing it. She paused. And because I have been the subject of a story that wasn't true for most of my adult life, and I know what it costs, and I thought the cost was too high for one man to keep paying it alone. The man from Laramie looked at her for a moment longer. Then he picked up his pen and made a note. Hennessy did not leave town. That would have been too clean. He stayed in Bitter Hollow and kept his store and his credit and his porch, full of men who needed somewhere to stand and complain. And the story about Rowan Vance did not disappear, because stories like that do not disappear when they are disproven. They only shrink. They only lose their force. They only become the thing a few older men mutter about in the back corner of the saloon, while the rest of the town has moved on to other concerns. Briggs kept his badge. The two men from Hennessy's party, whose names she did not know, left the territory by spring, which may or may not have been related. Mart Bidwell went back to being Tom's difficult cousin. Agnes Fremont continued to be the only midwife within 40 miles and continued to be wrong about most things. But the old doctor's records were in the county file now, and they said what they said. Mara went back to the surgery. She had to. Crane was 61, and the Mortensen boy had died, and there were other patients, and there was always another winter coming, and the surgery was where she was needed and where she worked. And work is not a small thing. It is the shape a person's life takes when they are paying attention to it. She went back in December and she worked through the winter, and Crane did not ask her about the North Fork, and she did not volunteer, and they worked together the way they had worked for 8 years, which was well. Vance came down in March. Not for salt and coffee, though he bought those too. He came down and tied the black gelding to the post outside the surgery and knocked on the door, and Tom Bidwell, who was sweeping the porch, opened it and looked at him with an expression of visible relief. which told Mara that Tom had been waiting for this visit and possibly taking bets with himself on when it would happen. She was in the back room. She heard the knock and heard Tom and heard the voice, and she set down the bandage she was rolling and stood up and smoothed her apron and stood there for a moment with her hands at her sides. Then she walked out. He was standing in the front office with his hat in his hands, which she had never seen him do before, and his face had the look it got when he was working something out. "Mara," he said. "Rowan." Tom found somewhere else to be with impressive speed. "I've been thinking," Vance said, about the fact that I have a cabin with 2 rooms and I have been using one of them for storage for 4 years. And a man who is using half his cabin for storage is a man who has given up on something without admitting it." She looked at him. "That's a complicated way to say something," she said. "I'm a complicated man. I'm working on it." He turned the hat brim once through his hands. "I'm asking you something. I want to be clear that I'm asking and not assuming, because I have noticed that you do not respond well to assumptions." "I don't. I'm asking if you would consider coming back up to the North Fork, not to investigate anything, not as a doctor's project, as a—" He stopped. He looked at her directly, which cost him something. She could see it cost him something, and she did not make it easier for him because she wanted to hear it said out loud. "As a person, I want there. As the person I want there." The surgery was very quiet. She thought about what it meant to be a woman of 26 in a territory where the options were limited, and the talk was constant, and the road between what you wanted and what you were permitted to want was full of people standing in it with their hands near their guns. She thought about the 8 years in these 2 rooms, and the fact that the 2 rooms were good rooms and the work was good work, and she was not unhappy, she had not been unhappy. But there is a difference between not unhappy and the other thing, and she knew the difference, and she had known it since a morning on a frozen river when she had gone out onto the ice on her belly toward a man she did not know, because something in her had said, without using words, "Go." "I'm not giving up the surgery," she said. His eyes came up. "I didn't ask you to. I'll come up in the spring and I'll come down in the fall when Crane needs me, and I'll come down faster than that if there's a case. I'm a doctor's assistant. That's a real thing, and I won't put it aside." "I know it's real," he said. "I know you. I'm not asking you to put it aside. And I'm not going to be a woman who disappears into a mountain because a man wants her there. I'm going to be exactly who I am, which is a large, opinionated, argumentative woman who carries her father's rifle and writes things down and will fight you about medicine every single time you try to get on a horse when your lung hasn't cleared." Something at the corner of his mouth moved. "I know that too." "All right," she said. "Then, yes." He looked at her. The hat stopped moving in his hands. "Yes," she said again. "I'll come back up." He did not cross the room dramatically. He was not that kind of man. He stood where he was, and she stood where she was, and they looked at each other across the front office of a surgery in Bitter Hollow, Wyoming Territory, in the March of 1887, 2 people who had arrived at something by the particular combination of accident and stubbornness and paying attention that is actually how most true things happen. Then she walked over to him, and he put his hat on the desk and took both her hands in his. The frostbitten fingers healed now, the grip firm and warm. And she thought, standing there, that this was nothing like a story. It was not clean, and it was not simple, and nobody would tell it right. The town would say what the town always said. There would be more hard winters and more disagreements and more patience and more times when she would have to fight for the thing she believed was true against people who wanted something easier. But here was the thing she had understood, standing on the porch in the cold yard, with her legs shaking and 9 horsemen going back down the trail. You do not defeat a story by being better than it. You defeat it by being more persistent than it, by writing things down and building a case and standing in the road when everyone else has stepped aside. Not because you are fearless, but because the cost of not standing there is higher than the cost of standing there. And you have done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic is clear. Rowan Vance was not a cursed man. He was a man who had suffered real losses and been handed a false explanation for them, and had lived inside that false explanation so long it had started to feel like skin. Mara Quinn had peeled it off him with records and reason and 10 days in a cold cabin, and what was underneath was just a man, flawed and scarred and still standing, same as anyone. That was the whole of the miracle, if you wanted to call it that. Not supernatural, not ordained, not fated. Just 2 people paying attention when most people had decided not to, and finding, at the end of the paying attention, that the thing they had been looking for was standing right there, and had been the whole time. She held his hands in the cold surgery light, and outside Bitter Hollow went about its business, and the mountains stood up to the west the way they always stood, indifferent and permanent and beautiful, and the North Fork ran over its rocks in the high country 8 miles away, waiting for spring.